and welcome to session 3. In this session, we're going to be looking at content literacy for adolescent dysfluent readers. We'll be identifying and implementing fluency building strategies that are specifically designed for secondary readers. We'll discuss the role of sight word recognition and apply approaches to support older students who have not yet mastered high frequency words. We're going to analyze the impact of limited reading practice and access to appropriate text on adolescent reading fluency. We're also going to talk through solutions for that. We'll discuss how cognitive factors like processing speed and working memory impact reading comprehension. We will debunk some common myths about leveled reading, and then we're going to practice some fluency strategies together that are perfect for across content areas for adolescents. So let's dive in and first start discussing leveled reading and text complexity. Leveled reading refers to the idea that books are numbered based on their difficulty. The idea behind a leveled reader is that each book is given a number or level based on the difficulty of that text. Each student would take a test to tell them what their level was, and then the student should only read books at that level. A lexile refers to the number or level of a student's reading. The lexile is measured based on a computer algorithm, and it takes into account sentence length, word repetition, syllabication in words, if there are a lot of multi-syllable words in the text, and a number of things like that. There is a lot of misunderstanding about leveled readers. And so that's where we're going to start our conversation today, really with looking at some myths and myth busting, being myth number 1, that kids should read at their just right level. And you'll hear this, and even when you go into school buildings, you may see posters or you may see classroom libraries that have different book baskets with a level written on that basket. So this idea suggests that students should just stay within their level as a reader. And this idea has become dated based on the research that we now have. And it doesn't take a lot of other factors into account. For example, if the student has a high background knowledge in an area, they can read at a higher lexile. Being able to read and reading comprehension is so closely tied to background knowledge and vocabulary. If I am reading a text on baseball and I have played baseball, I love baseball, and I know all the vocabulary of baseball, I'm going to be able to read that text at a much higher level versus someone who knows nothing about baseball, has never played the game. So a lexile is based on these quantitative facts. So just these numbers and statistics of how long the sentences are, the types of words that are used in the text, whether long or short words. And that's not helpful to our students, especially if they're reaching for a book that they want to read, and then they're told you can't read that book because it's too hard or it's not on your just right level. That's a problem. If they have the motivation to read a text at a higher level, then we should support that and then just help them with scaffolds of how to get through a more difficult text, not take it away from them. And one of the best things we can do to help elevate our students' reading comprehension and getting them reading on higher levels is to build up their background knowledge and their vocabulary, which they will not do if they're staying and reading at the same baseline of lexile. They have to be exposed to rich vocabulary, even if they can't access it independently or decode it, just by listening to it, they're going to be able to figure out new words in context. If we are watering down text so that they can access it independently, they are going to stay at that level. There's no way for them to continue to build unless they're exposed to that more difficult text. Myth number 2 is if a student struggles with a word, they should use pictures or context clues to figure it out. And this approach is called cueing. There's a reading approach called the 3 cueing strategy. And cueing just means really like looking for clues to help me understand the text. So they'll look for, does it make sense? What's the structure of the text? And are there any pictures or images that are going to help me figure out what I'm reading? Basically using those context clues. The problem with this approach is that I'm not leaning on my ability to decode and understand the word. I don't have to have understanding of a word to be able to look at the picture and try to bridge it together. And this approach works for a while you're looking at picture books in primary grades. But once you move into sixth grade science, context clues aren't going to help you to understand the academic vocabulary or content domain specific words that are in that text. Students will have to know how to decode it. We call them word attack skills, how to attack that word to be able to break it down and find the meaning. And that's where root words and morphology becomes very critical. So if you look at our national data, we have been really using and relying on the 3 cueing system for a very long time, the last 20 years or so. This is also part of the whole language approach, or that school of thought of how to teach reading. But research has shown us over and over again that phonics is the better approach. And that's really what the science of reading is about. It's about using evidence-based practices, and the 3 cueing strategy has been found to be not effective. It will show growth for students in those early elementary years. But again, once they hit middle school and move from learning to read to reading to learn in secondary, and you can't rely on context clues and those things to help you decode a difficult content area text. Cueing teaches students to compensate rather than to actually read or rely on their reading ability. Skilled readers rely on their ability to decode. That takes us to myth number 3. Reading level is a fixed and meaningful measure of ability. And research has shown that that is not accurate. Reading should not be fixed. We want our students continually growing and becoming better readers. And it's not a meaningful measure because it doesn't take into account the background knowledge that I have or the vocabulary knowledge that I have within a specific text. So our reading level is not a diagnosis. It fluctuates based on the type of text we are reading. And Lexiles have really shifted from being these tools to help us identify what text students should practice fluency reading with to becoming almost their identity. You can have 2 students with the same exact Lexile, but they perform completely different on a comprehension test based on their knowledge of whatever the text is about. So background knowledge will trump reading level or Lexile every time. Myth 4, progress is shown by moving up levels. So this leveled system actually creates an illusion of progress because it tracks our gains. Maybe we move from a 700 now to an 850 Lexile, or the letter F to a letter H. Leveled text can mask decoding problems by allowing students to rely on context. So as a result, students may advance in levels without actually developing the underlying skills needed for fluent reading. The concept of text complexity, or how difficult a text is, really relies on 3 different components. And you can think of these as like a 3-legged stool. Each one is equally important. So we just talked about Lexile. The quantitative piece of text complexity is that Lexile. It is just an algorithm that doesn't take anything else into account, the topic into account. It just measures the difficulty based on word length, word frequency, sentence length, sentence structure, the number of words in a sentence, and it computes this, and then it spits out the number of how difficult this text is. So that is the quantitative component of text complexity, and it's the component that most teachers rely on alone, which is a mistake. The other, just as important component is the qualitative piece of text complexity. So qualitative measures really look at those things that make a text complex or difficult to read, as far as maybe unfamiliar language, like a dialect like Huck Finn, or Deep South dialect, or Elizabethan English, Shakespeare, whether the text has multiple timelines that they have to follow, like flashbacks and flash forwards. Those are difficult for some students, especially struggling readers, to track who the narrator is, or if they're jumping scenes without clear transitions. Those are the type of things that make up the qualitative measures of text complexity. The reader and task considerations, which is the third part of the triangle or the third leg of the stool, is equally important. Reader considerations refer to what the student or individual brings to the text, what their motivation is, what their background experience and knowledge and life is that helps them make connections with this text. You can kind of think of like Slumdog Millionaire, all the stuff that he brought, his personal experience to the game that helped him to answer the questions. Kind of the same thing here. It's what you're bringing to the table that's going to help you understand and really interpret this text. And the other part of that task and reader considerations, the task considerations at the type of text as far as it's difficult to read because it's like a W-2 form. The types of questions that are asked that you have to read and understand and interpret make it very difficult. Those are the three components of text complexity. All of those ingredients go into deciding whether a text is difficult or not. Here's a look at why we cannot rely on Lexile alone. I mentioned that the qualitative piece is what brings in or takes into account the maturity level or the age appropriateness. 50 Shades of Grey has the same Lexile as Charlotte's Web. So we can't just say, here's a book based on your Lexile. Sentence length, word repetition. We have to take into account that qualitative piece of, is it appropriate? What's the maturity level? And here's another look at that. Hemingway, The Sun Also Rises, was written at a third grade Lexile. The Handmaid's Tale was written at the Lexile of a fourth grader. Kite Runner was written at the Lexile of a fifth grader. So although maybe a 10-year-old or a fifth grader can decode the words in Kite Runner, by no means should he or she be reading that text. It's not age developmentally appropriate. Diary of a Wimpy Kid is actually written at a higher Lexile and is still one of the most popular books for second through fourth graders. So the moral of this story is that it is not necessary to have Lexile text or leveled text in order to increase student fluency. Remember this session, session 3, we're really focusing on what can we do in our content areas to help develop fluency or smooth reading for our adolescent readers. So if we don't need those leveled readers or Lexiled texts, how do we build fluency for our middle schoolers? Well, the first step is we have to have some systematic phonics instruction. We understand that that will not come, and we understand that that won't come typically through your content area class, but know that we cannot become fluent at something if we don't do it accurately. So that really is step 1, getting them that phonics instruction. But what we can do in our classroom are provide repeated readings of texts, which builds automaticity and confidence. So research has been done over and over again, and it just makes sense. If we read something more than once, we're obviously going to understand it better each time we read it. So it helps with our comprehension, but it also helps with our fluency and how well we read. Think about if you have been in theater before and you're practicing a play. The first few times you are practicing your lines, it might be a little rough, but the more you read it, then it becomes conversational and like it should, and your lines become prosodic, which is the goal, having prosody that makes our reading sound like speech. Also, small children love to read the same books over and over again. And that's one of their favorite habits because they're familiar with the story and they build confidence around that. They know the story by heart. And part of that is the repeated reading strategy. The other thing we can do that will help with fluency is building background knowledge. The more you know about a topic, the faster and more fluently you can read about it. So if I know nothing about motorcycle engines and I try to read a text, that is going to be very difficult for me to read fluently because I do not have familiarity with the vocabulary or the understanding. And so it's going to be a labored process for me, as if conversely, if I would read something that's more in my wheelhouse, I'm going to read that fluently and understand it deeply. Previewing vocabulary. If we preview vocabulary with students, then that way we are calling attention to any difficult vocabulary, practicing saying it together, anticipating anything that might trip them up. while they're reading, and doing that ahead of time and practicing it, calling attention to it, it's going to help their fluency. This is also especially important for English language learners. All of these strategies, the repeated reading, the background knowledge building, and the vocabulary previewing, all necessary for English language learners. And here's a quote to kind of help with our understanding of previewing vocabulary. When students encounter too many unfamiliar words in a text, their cognitive resources are diverted to decoding and word meaning, impairing fluency and comprehension. So previewing key vocabulary before reading helps reduce this load. So if all my mental energy is going into trying to figure out what that word is, my mental energy is not going into comprehending the meaning or the message of the book. Prosody instruction, reading so it sounds natural like speech, improves our fluency reading also. And if I read choppy or monotone, that is going to impact my reading comprehension negatively. And I'll miss a lot of those little, we call it verbal reasoning, the inferencing, reading in between the lines. If we read monotone, we will miss those things. And there's a strategy that we are going to practice together to help with our prosody and our fluency, the instruction in phrasing. So we're going to practice reading in phrases versus reading in individual words. And then also providing appropriate text. So this one is more difficult when it comes to our middle schoolers. So the difference between a decodable text and a lexile text. Decodable means it matches whatever stage or phonetic rule that students are learning right now. The decodable text practices that specific skill. So if I am teaching my students an IGH spelling rule, like light, night, fright, then the decodable text that I will provide them will have a lot of practice with that spelling rule in particular. So that's the difference between a lexile or a leveled reader and a decodable text. Decodable texts are preferable, but that's the tricky part because we typically don't have phonics or spelling rules being taught at the middle school, and we don't have age-appropriate decodable texts. Most of the decodable texts are written for small children, so they have young, immature themes, and they're not really appropriate, age-appropriate, or I like the term age-respectful for our middle school kids. So a little bit later in the session, we're going to dive into practicing strategies together. Background knowledge is the information and understanding a reader already has about the world, a topic, or a concept to which they bring to the text. Kind of like that Slumdog Millionaire approach. Here are all the things that I know that help me answer the questions of comprehension in this text. So background knowledge is one of our key ingredients or threads in Scarborough's reading rope. And if you're in the high school methods course, we're going to have more about background knowledge later when it is tied to comprehension, tied to non-comprehenders. This right now, we're really looking at background knowledge and how it supports dysfluent readers. Even if I am a strong decoder, I have to have background knowledge in order to be able to understand or comprehend what I'm reading. So if you were to get this message, so if you were to read this passage and then I would ask you questions over it, you may be stumped. So I'll give you a second to read it. Any guesses what this passage is referring to? This particular passage is from a newspaper article from England. So maybe that's a clue that might help. It is about cricket. If you're from the US, then like most Americans, you probably don't have a high background knowledge in the sport of cricket. I mentioned baseball before as a reference, and this is why. So there was a study done, and we just refer to it as the baseball study. It's been replicated over and over again since the 1980s. It takes 4 groups of students, 2 groups that are high readers, and 2 groups that are the more low achieving readers. And of those students, some of them have a high knowledge of baseball and some of them have a low knowledge of baseball. So the prediction or assumption was that the 2 groups of students that were high readers would outperform the 2 groups of students who were low readers, but that was not the case. And this has been replicated over and over again with the same outcome. The students, even if they have a lower reading ability, If they have high knowledge of baseball and they answer their questions on baseball, they can perform at a higher level. What we bring to the text, just like that text complexity triangle model of reader and task considerations, what I bring to the text is key. My own experiences. Think about all of the vocabulary that is in baseball: pitcher, field, mound, pop fly, out, all of these things that if you are a child and you have not played baseball, you would have all of that vocabulary that could be a barrier versus understanding how the game is played and understanding all of the vocabulary. You're going to be able to read that at a much higher level, which takes us to our point of prior knowledge effects are powerful when it comes to reading comprehension. It is actually the single most important factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows and brings to the text. It outweighs IQ and learning styles. Also, typically, if I have an experience with something from prior knowledge, it's going to be more meaningful and relatable to me. So every mental operation hinges upon the ease of access to information that we acquired earlier in life. And explaining to students that easy and hard, it's all relative. What experiences you've had in your life prior makes something tough or tricky or easy. So prior knowledge is huge. That's why we want students to have as many field trips and real world experiences, because it brings so much to their learning experience. So since students have such a wide variety or range of background knowledge, how do we know what students actually know before we teach them? Well, an anticipation guide or a KWL chart are great strategies to practice free reading activities. You can do a quick little survey to see how comfortable students are, or how much they know about a topic, even if it's just a self-reflection. I'm not familiar at all, I'm a little bit familiar, or I'm very familiar with this topic or this word. Because if no one knows it, then this is what you can make sure that you teach in a mini lesson before you begin your unit to address all of these things. And front loading our background knowledge, it doesn't have to take a long time. Research shows 3 to 5 minutes is sufficient just to help kind of activate prior knowledge or build background knowledge. A video clip, image, photograph, real life experience, anything we can do to kind of help set the stage and activate their prior knowledge. One of the difficult things right now as a teacher is trying to compensate for the deficits in students' current background knowledge. So students will come to you as 6th, 7th, or 8th graders, and many of them don't have the common base of knowledge that you expect them to have. And that's actually one of the hardest things for newer teachers, is to determine on what level, ability level, their students can perform, trying to gauge that and calibrate that. Sometimes we expect way too much, or we're not raising the bar high enough. So it takes a full year to really figure out what your students can do collectively and individually. One of the reasons that there's such a deficit in their current background knowledge is because they haven't had a lot of instruction. Only 1% of primary students in our country, kindergarten, first and second grade students, 1% have been taught science and social studies. Most of them just get it integrated into their reading time. They don't have a separate class or subject for this. In grades 3, 4, and 5, those intermediate grades, it's really hit and miss just based on the school's schedule. So they might have social studies for one quarter, science for the next quarter. If it is their quarter where they're getting science, they may only get it for 45 minutes a week or 20 minutes a day, but it's the first thing to get cut if there's a fog delay or a snow delay or a pep rally or assembly, because we're not going to cut reading and math instruction. So it's always science and social studies that go first. It's not prioritized in our curriculum, unfortunately. Another reason is that we don't have as much science and social studies content knowledge, which creates that background knowledge deficit, is because we have prioritized reading and math so much. So our students were not doing well in reading. So let's give them more reading. Not doing well in math, give them more math. Well, that time has to come from somewhere. So we take out science and social studies from the content or from our daily agenda, and we put in more reading practice time, which actually has had an adverse effect on our reading comprehension skills because background knowledge is a huge part of understanding text. So we have shot ourselves in the foot as a nation and created this cyclical downward spiral because we're not reading well. So let's do more reading, but take away more the opportunity to build background knowledge so that they have less background knowledge. And it really has been a detriment to reading achievement. And then the shift in instruction has happened too, to where the way we teach reading. So we've shifted to a skill-based instruction. So we teach context clues, finding the main idea, creating inferences. And we assume that if you can find the main idea or make an inference in one text, that you can find the main idea or make inferences in all texts. And that's not the case. It's contingent upon your background knowledge of that text. So instead of what we should be doing is really front loading whatever our lesson is or whatever that text is, we should be front loading it with lots of understanding of background concepts, whether it's geography or if the text takes place in a certain time period, the Dust Bowl, understanding a drought, these types of content that are going to have an impact on the context, understanding the context and comprehending the text. We don't do that. We take away that front loading and we just rely on, oh, if you can't understand this, let's rely on context clues. Context clues are not going to help you if you don't understand what World War II Germany was like. You have to have that understanding of the time, the region, the place, the people. That's where content instruction is critical, and our students have a deficit of it. So one of our threads that really impacts our reading fluency is sight word recognition. That automaticity. Louisa Moats, who's one of our foremost researchers and developer of curriculum for phonics, said this: processing language, especially at the level of sounds, syllables, and words, is automatic. That is fast and unconscious. If we are good readers, then processing print has also become automatic. So think about this. At this point in your life and in your education, probably most of the words that you encounter, you read pretty automatically. When's the last time you've had to slow down and sound out a word? Unless it was a very technical term, or we become automatic with recognizing words because of frequent exposure to text. So most of the words in your word bank, in your personal vocabulary or lexicon, are automatic when you see them. And that's the goal. The goal is to move from decoding to automaticity. I can sound out a word, or I can attack that word with phonics skills if I see it and if I've never seen it before and I don't know how to say it or read it. But then that word, after repetition and after reading it and being exposed to it enough, that word should become automatic. So we are become really good readers, and because we are good at processing print and have automaticity with words. And that's what fluency is all about. It is all about seeing a word and knowing it immediately, not having to slow down and sound it out. When you have a middle school student that is really struggling with reading and you ask them to read out loud, it will be very evident if they are a dysfluent reader. So if they are reading choppy or really struggling through each word, kind of like a robot, you can tell if they're processing the word at individual word level. You can explain to them that their eyes see 4 or 5 words at a time. We're trying to help their mouth catch up to their eyes. So try to say phrases instead of individual words. The importance of that is that adolescents with slower processing speeds will struggle to keep up with the demands of longer text because all of their energy is going on each individual word and recalling that word from memory or decoding that word. Whereas if they can see a word and say it automatically, then they don't have to slow down and figure it out, and it helps with their whole cognitive process. We call it cognitive overload. If they are reading in chunks and decoding at the word level, and it's struggle. It is too much to ask them then to answer higher order questions, write an essay about the text. All of their mental energy just went into decoding that. So their cognitive bandwidth is limited for comprehension. We see this all the time in assessments when it comes to test taking. The standardized test and the state test that students have to take now, they're reading 2 to 3 texts and then having to compare and contrast those and then write about it. If a student is struggling just to get through one text fluently, they are not going to have the mental capacity and energy to be able to get through all of the tasks that they're asked to do in writing. Your working memory can hold 4 or 5 pieces of information for about 20 seconds. So think about all the things happening in a struggling reader's brain. Their working memory is working really hard to decode, plus hold that idea, plus hold whatever the question was that was asked of them originally or their purpose for reading, and integrate any new information coming in through the text. It is exhausting for struggling readers. And it's easy to understand why it's difficult for them to perform on these multi-step assessments where we're reading multiple passages and then answering questions and writing. Also, you'll see if a student is struggling with their working memory or executive function or their reading fluency, this will be apparent in their writing. They are not going to write really complex sentence structures or multiple paragraphs because it takes so much effort to pull from their working memory because they were so focused on decoding and just reading fluently and understanding what they were reading. So we have the text that we're reading or the input, what we're receiving as input, and holding in our working memory. We can do that much easier if we're a fluent reader. If that input is a smooth transition, then we have additional practice with whatever that concept is or that skill or reading. We have multiple or repeated readings. That practice is going to help us move it into long-term memory. All those are held together by executive function, which is the ability to keep myself organized and self-regulated, paying attention to what I'm reading so that my mind doesn't wander onto something else. I can keep everything together, pay attention to the task at hand. If a student does not have fluency, that all makes that process so much more difficult for a student. So fluent reading is so crucial. Here's another way to look at it just as an illustration. So we have the decoding side, and we have this island of decoding, and then we have to get to comprehension. How do we get from decoding to understanding what we're reading? It's that bridge of fluency. So I have to read accurately. I have to read at a good pace, using phrasing. So I'm reading phrases and not single individual words at a time. It is the missing link there so many times to comprehension. This starts even in the very beginning of a student's education with their learning and becoming automatic with even letter recognition. So if you are working with students in your class, by the time they get to middle school, I'm sure they won't be working on their letter formation, but it does play an important part in their reading development, and it's worth mentioning here. Over 97% of written text is in lowercase letters. When students are learning to form their letters, because they're going to see lowercase more, so they should recognize those first. For capital letters, many of those are duplicative of their lowercase letter and don't have to be taught because they're identical. But I'm sure many of you probably did not receive handwriting instruction when you were in elementary school. If you did, you were among the rare group. Handwriting was taken out of the curriculum around the time, a few years after the development of the academic standards, whether it's the Indiana academic standards or the Common Core standards, whatever the state adopted. Handwriting was taken out of, handwriting is not listed as a standard after second grade. So we interpret the standards incorrectly most of the time. So many educators interpret the standards incorrectly. We see this academic standards as a list of things we're supposed to teach, and that's not the case. It's not a to-do list. Those are things that our students should be able to do. Those are the outcomes of what we teach. So we went through several years of teachers just saying, here's an H, make your H look like mine, with no explicit instruction. So all handwriting, all letters should start at the top and go down. Every letter. Many students now you'll see write from the bottom up. And why does this matter? It matters because when you're learning to read, you also learn to form the letter simultaneously. And if you think back to the reading brain and those pictures or images I showed you of the multiple blue dots versus the big red struggling reader dot, that letter formation is on that strong reader brain as helping me to form that letter. If I know if my handwriting is fluent, and I'm forming the letter B as I'm learning the sound ba and the name of the letter B, all of those things go together. And it creates an easier retrieval when I am decoding, when I'm spelling, and when I'm writing. Everything's so inextricably linked. To remove handwriting instruction from the curriculum is handicapping our reading. I want to play a little game real quick. So I would like for everyone to pick up something to write with. And you're going to do this with your non-dominant hand, no cheating. And I'm going to show you the correct pencil grip trick. So if you haven't learned this before, something good and helpful just to know. So your non-dominant hand, you're going to take your thumb and your first two fingers and whatever your writing utensil is. So you're going to take it by the tip of your writing utensil and like you're picking it up. So picking it up by the ballpoint end. And then I'm going to flip it straight back to rest in between my thumb and forefinger. So to do that again, non-dominant hand, 3 fingers, picking it up by the point, and then just flipping it back. That's the correct pencil grip. So holding that pencil grip, I want you to write this sentence in your best cursive handwriting. If you never learned cursive, that's okay. Write in your best print handwriting. But this is like wedding level invitation, like the best that you can do. So just take a minute and do this little simulation together. So we're going to write this sentence. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. And we're writing this sentence because it contains every letter in the alphabet. So let's go ahead and write correct pencil grip. So go ahead and just take a second. And if you want to pause this, you can. Just work on that sentence. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. Keep that pencil grip and your best handwriting. Okay, how'd that work out for you? Probably not great. It is tricky. So your effort in your mind was probably really focused on holding that pencil, right? And on trying to form the letters. Think about how long it took you to write that one sentence. And maybe you're still working on it now. It takes so much longer than you think it's going to take. So why is this simulation important? Why are we doing this? It takes 3 to 5 years to become fluent with handwriting. Most of our students do not get handwriting practice. So when we are asking them to write something, I go back to this picture here. We need 3 to 5 years to develop fluent handwriting. Most of our students do not get that. So they are struggling not only with decoding, reading fluently, holding things in their working memory, self-regulating, keeping it all together, with practice shifting it into their long-term memory. And then we ask them to write about what they read. And if they're writing and they haven't developed handwriting fluency yet, think of the effort that you just put into that one sentence. So if you had to write a full essay like this, what type of complex sentences would you write? How many paragraphs would you make it? You would do the least amount of work as possible because the cognitive lift was so heavy. So many times it's not that our students are lazy. It's that they have not developed fluency in so many of these basic foundational skills that we are asking them to do higher level thinking, and they cannot do it because they are struggling with all the basics. All of their mental efforts and energies are going into the basic skills of decoding, reading fluently, and even handwriting. But we want them to compare and contrast. They don't have the ability, the cognitive bandwidth to hold all of those things together. So here's a few more reasons why handwriting is so crucial. There's a clear connection between the development of handwriting, reading, writing, and language and critical thinking. Yet approximately 30% of elementary students struggle with basic handwriting. If students are not given the opportunity to master handwriting, they're going to struggle with all of the following: retrieving letters from memory, reproducing letters on paper, spelling accurately, extracting meaning from reading, interpreting the context of words and phrases, reading as in decoding, writing and writing composition. All of those things that students may be struggling with can trace back to some gaps in their foundational skills of phonics and of handwriting. As I mentioned, I mentioned the standards earlier. So the Indiana academic standards only require handwriting instruction in grade 1. But we know that they're only going to develop that mastery of fluency if they practice 3 to 5 years. So many of the schools that I've worked with, especially with the onset of state standardized testing becoming digital, even at the 3rd grade level, and now moving into the 2nd grade level, teachers and administrators are really concerned with their students' ability for typing. If these are timed tests, I want to make sure my students can do well on the test, so I want them to have typing practice. However, this is not developmentally appropriate. We especially can't usurp or take away handwriting instruction in order to replace it with typing. Handwriting instruction is crucial for reading development. Sometimes as educators, we make poor decisions because we want our students to do well on the test. This test will change year after year. The data will change year after year. What won't change is your student becoming a lifelong reader and writer, and those should be our priorities. So this is all information just for you to consider when you have your own classroom and you see students struggling. It will give you a better idea or insight of where those struggles might be coming from. It may be a lack of handwriting automaticity, of reading fluency, or of phonics. But the great thing about fluency is the fix is simple. It just comes from more practice. And that is something that you can do in your classroom. You can practice all of these things, the handwriting, the reading, in your classroom, regardless of what you're teaching. Adolescents, our middle schoolers, are given reading comprehension assessments. So whether that's our state test, which right now is called iLearn, NWEA is a formative assessment students get, or iReady is a formative assessment students get beginning, middle, and end of school year to track student growth. So students receive these reading comprehension tests. If they score low on these tests, they're going to look at the data. They'll see students are advanced, proficient or at level or below proficiency or way below proficiency. And they'll categorize them like that. And so if they group them, they'll try to remediate or provide intervention for students with comprehension strategies. Again, 90% of the time when they're trying to remediate or intervene, support students with interventions, it's going to be comprehension strategies like the context clues, like trying to inference that 3 cueing system, which we know is not effective. Fluency instruction is consistently missing when we are trying to support adolescent struggling readers. And typically we don't have, as I mentioned before, decodable readers that are age respectful for our middle school students. So having quality materials to practice their fluency reading with is very difficult. How can you support them in your classroom? So remember, I mentioned fluency. This is an easy fix. It's simple. It just means more practice. So you can do this within your classroom. Students just need more repetition, more practice. And there's something called space practice versus mass practice. Mass practice is really that cramming, like the night before the test, we get it all in, where spaced practice is practicing every week leading up to the test or reviewing flashcards once a week. Spaced practice is more effective than mass practice. So one of the key ingredients in an effective curriculum is one that spiral reviews or brings in concepts every once in a while to review those most important concepts that we want to make sure are transferred to their long-term memory, that they keep there. So an accelerated learner, kind of those quick learners, might need only 1 to 2 practices with a concept or skill before they become independently proficient. On pace has a larger range, so anywhere from 4 to 14 practice sessions before they become proficient independently. Our developing learners or our striving readers need 20 or more practices with a concept and skill. So if we transfer that back to our handwriting fluency practice, our decoding or reading out loud practice, so often students just aren't getting the amount of practices that they need in order to become proficient, that they get left behind. In fact, we will even recommend them for special education when the fact isn't a cognitive deficiency or delay. It is a lack of practice. Actually, almost 20% of students who are in special education would not be there if they would have received explicit systematic phonics instruction. So practice goes right along with that. Sometimes students get so far behind just because there's not enough time or space in the curriculum to slow down and give them the amount of practices that they need. So this is a big question with your team and with your department as you're going into student teaching. Something to be cognizant of after first time instruction. How much practice are students getting with the skill? And it's never too late to add more practice. So if you see students who are really struggling to read out loud fluently, what's the answer? The answer is they read out loud more. And we do that in a way where it's safe and does not call attention to their deficiencies. Round robin reading or popcorn reading, the research is very clear on that. That has a negative impact on readers, especially adolescent readers. If you call on them to read out loud and they're not ready, or they're a struggling reader, it actually hurts their reading. We need reading practice out loud, but it's got to take place a certain way that students will benefit from it. And that's what we're going to practice in just a little bit. So you may remember back to your elementary days of DEAR, DEAR, drop everything and read. That movement came out of this research that shows us 20 minutes a day of reading. If a student can do that, they're going to be exposed to 1.8 million words, and they're most likely to score 90th percentile on a standardized test, which that's high. That's what we want. If they read 5 minutes a day, they will most likely encounter 282,000 words and score in the 50th percentile, Whereas if they read only 1 minute a day, they're only going to be exposed to 8,000 words a year and most likely score in the 10th percentile. So let's define what that reading, when I say reading 20 minutes a day, what that reading is. That's real reading, not fake reading. So I have my page or my book or my text. My eyes are tracking. My brain is engaged. I can read independently pretty smoothly and I understand what I'm reading. 20 minutes of that kind of reading, not I'm staring out the window, I'm flipping pages, just killing time. So 20 minutes of real reading can get students to the 90th percentile on their tests. And this is what, whenever I work directly with students in classrooms, I always tell them, you want to be the smartest person in the room, read. So this is our goal. So if we set our goal at 20 minutes a day of reading, this will also help build that reading fluency. Richard Allington, a reading researcher, recommends 90 minutes of reading a day. And that's across all day, across all subject areas, and 40 minutes of writing. And that writing is real writing, composition type writing. It isn't like fill in the blanks or bullets, that type of thing. It's real, composition writing. Many states, and Indiana included, there has been for a long time a 90-minute reading block. The state required an uninterrupted 90-minute reading block. But in that reading block, it wasn't just for reading. So it was where we did all of our reading instruction. And typically, they would find less than 15 minutes of actual reading happening within that 90-minute reading block. So while these are the recommendations saying if you read this much and write this much in your school day, then students, their achievement across your whole school, it will elevate your school achievement. Whenever I work with schools directly, I just say audit wherever you're at right now, whatever the number or the quantity of reading that you're doing now, and increase it. There's nowhere to go but up. For many schools, this feels like an unreachable goal. So just improve on whatever you're already doing, increase those minutes of reading. Another way to look at reading fluency is to think of it in this equation. So it's automaticity, knowing words automatically, plus prosody, where my voice sounds natural, like rhythmic speaking. That is what makes up reading fluency. And we can practice fluency by breaking those two things apart. So automaticity, my sight words, flashcard words, just lots of word exposure. Prosody, doing things like reading poetry out loud, doing plays or readers' theater out loud and practicing my lines. That develops prosody. So those two skills and working and practicing those two skills can create fluency. So we are going to move into some strategies now, what this actually looks like in the classroom. All of these strategies that I'm going to share with you can be used in any grade level and for any subject area. My full-time job is going around the country and teaching current teachers and principals these types of strategies, because what happens in school achievement is you can have the world's best English teachers, reading teachers, until you get the science teachers and the social studies teachers supporting their literacy in their classrooms, you don't see achievement move. Once you get science and social studies teachers leveraging or utilizing literacy practices in their classroom with their content area text, school achievement skyrockets. That is the hinge point. The science and social studies teachers or content area teachers getting on board, and there being common reading comprehension strategies and language. So the first strategy I want to share with you is called scooping. And so you've heard me mention reading in phrases, and that's really what scooping is all about. So this is a resource from Florida State University, and they have tons of free online resources there that are vetted and very good if you're looking for any resources. So this is a quick handout from their website. And scooping is where we physically take our finger and we put it under the first word in the phrase. So for this first phrase, it's "we know that." So instead of reading "we know that," which is what a dysfluent reader would do, We're going to read it in a phrase and we're going to scoop it. So it's kind of a tactile learning strategy. We know that. And then we lift up our finger and put it under the next phrase, set an example, pick it up, put it under the next phrase. Would you please? And then we come down to the next. And we go through those together, and we can do them out loud as a class, or you can do it with a small group. These are age respectful phrases. And as you can see, they're repeated over and over again. So would you please is in there 4 or 5 times. Each one of those phrases is. So we've got that repeated reading. And we're working on our prosody. If you don't want to use an isolated example like this with the phrases, you can use any text that you're working on in class. So it's helpful if they have digital annotation tools or if they have their reading passage on paper. You can kind of integrate a little grammar there, or we can circle the first word in the sentence and then start the scoop there. Maybe circle every other 4th or 5th word, and we're going to just start the scoop. And that helps them practice reading in phrases and not reading at the individual level. So one thing that I want you to take with you into your future classrooms is this thought. Every text students will read needs a before, a during, and an after reading strategy. So you kind of think it as a visual frame for a book. So imagine a book. I need a before, a during, and an after reading strategy to surround or encompass that book. I'm never going to give students just a text to cold read and then have them answer questions or take a quiz. So every reading needs a before, during, and after reading strategy. For before reading strategies, this is going to be a lot of the previewing vocabulary, building background knowledge, those types of things. The during reading strategy is how I interact with the text. I need to read my beach read by Ellen Hildebrand, my beach novel. I'm going to read very differently than I read my tax forms. So students need to realize there are different ways to read different texts. So they're going to read their English fiction text, like The Outsiders. They're going to read that differently than they read their science chapter in the textbook. We need a strategy for how to read those. And that's the during reading piece. The after reading strategy is, what are we doing with the text? After we read it, it was worth our time of reading. So what do we do with it now? We've got to think about it. We've got to talk about it and discuss it. We've got to write about it. What do we do with it? We have to do something to cement in the learning. And this after reading strategy is always the one that gets ditched because of class time. So I might do a beautiful job of previewing the vocabulary and building background knowledge through a mini lesson. We read the text and they were engaged. And then guess what? The class period's over and I send them out and we haven't done an after reading strategy. And the after reading strategy is so critical because it really seals in the learning. If you think of like an envelope, that is the seal to keeping all of that information in the brain retained. So these 3 strategies here, choral reading, echo reading, and read and review, are all during reading strategies. Choral reading has some good, has some great elements of pre-reading also. I'm going to model these for you and with you. So the first strategy we're going to model is choral reading. Choral reading is excellent because we're working on prosody, we're doing a repeated reading, we're doing vocabulary previewing, we're building our background knowledge. It mimics great. And so choral reading is one of the most beneficial reading practices that you can do as a classroom teacher. Doesn't matter what content you're teaching. Choral means we're reading all together out loud simultaneously. This is so effective because adolescents do not like to be singled out, especially if they are embarrassed or they have a deficit in a skill. To highlight that is incriminating and humiliating. So choral reading creates this safe space where everybody can participate. We're not just calling on 1 or 2 people who are typically the good readers who volunteer. Everyone has a voice. Our striving readers, our multi-language learners, everyone can participate. The research on choral reading is huge, from little kids to seniors in high school. Because we're reading in a group, it reduces anxiety, and it's one way to get everybody in the classroom closer to that 20-minute reading goal. Now, we're not going to read an entire text, choral reading, but it's a great way to start off a text, a new content or a new passage, a new chapter in your science book. I want to model this strategy for you utilizing just an online article about many kids can't read even in high school. Is the solution teaching reading in every class? Students need to be able to see the text, either if you have it projected on the screen or a text in front of them. But I would have them eyes up on the screen, kind of like karaoke ball, and I would model the text first. After I've built background knowledge, they know why we're talking about this, what the relevance is. So the actual choral reading part looks like this. So I start first. Class, I'm modeling, so I'm going to read the first paragraph, and then afterwards, we will read it together. Like many high school chemistry teachers, chemistry. Everyone take a look at that word, chemistry. That may have been a word that you have heard before, but you might not have seen how it's spelled. Notice it is not spelled with a K. It is CH, chemistry. Let's all say chemistry, chemistry. So CH, we know that it is a Greek word. That's why the CH makes the K sound. And many of our science terms are Greek in origin. So let me start again. Like many high school chemistry teachers, Angie Hackman instructs students on atoms. Oh, I'm going to stop there again. Atoms. We may have heard this word as in science, like a boy's name, and we notice that it is not spelled. We notice it is not spelled like the boy's name. It is spelled with a T-O, atoms. Everyone say atoms, atoms. Atoms matter, and she says how they influence the world around us. Let's keep reading. But Hackman also has another responsibility, multi-syllable word. Let's all practice together. Responsibility. Let's go together. Responsibility. In class, developing students' reading skills for about 20 of the 80 minutes of almost every class. She engages her, there's that word again, let's all say it together, chemistry students in literacy skills. And she said, closely reading passages from their textbooks, breaking apart prefixes and suffixes for relevant. Everyone say relevant, relevant. What does relevant mean? So relevant means it has something to do with what we're talking about. It has meaning, vocabulary, and identifying root words. During a recent lesson, she discussed the word intermolecular. Let's all say that word, intermolecular. If you notice the prefix on that word, what would the prefix of this word be? In is a prefix, but if we can actually expand that a little bit more, inter is the full prefix on that word. What would the root be on that word? Molecule, you're right. Dissecting its prefix, inter. Oh, if we would have kept reading, we would have found that. And connecting it to other words with the same prefix. Okay, that was my reading. Let's all do it together now. All right, so your voice, make it match mine. Ready? And here we go. Like many high school chemistry teachers, Angie Hackman instructs, blah, blah, blah. So you can see I modeled it first, and I stopped for anything that I thought might trip students up, whether it's an unfamiliar word, numbers. They struggle reading numbers out loud as far as like if something's, in the thousands, how to actually say it can be tricky for a lot of students. So I went through any words that might be difficult for them to say aloud. And now, so as we choral read, they know how to say those. They've heard them once before. And now everyone gets a chance to read out loud, and we're getting closer to that 20 minutes a day. And if they're a struggling reader or a multilingual learner, Their voice can kind of get lost in the crowd so they can still participate, but the spotlight is not shining on them. So that's a look at choral reading. So teacher reads and models, students read. So I wouldn't read the entire text in a choral reading fashion. I would do the first few paragraphs together to really get at the difficult vocabulary and get a feel for the rhythm of that particular text. And then I might say, all right, now with your elbow partner, we're going to keep choral reading with your elbow partner. So shift over, use a quiet voice, mouth to ear. So my 6-inch voice, not my 20-foot voice, because the noise can get very loud and some students are very sound sensitive. So they might struggle with that a little bit. So lower voice, lean over, read the text together. And we might do that for a few paragraphs. Again, it doesn't have to be the entire text, but it's a great kind of on-ramp for getting students started, getting over those barriers that might trip them up with pronunciation and vocabulary. So I have included the steps for choral reading. So how to break it down and actually walk through it. And I would say that all directions or instructions of a worksheet, of an activity, if you have written instructions, those should be chorally read. That is a really easy classroom routine to create and a great way to sneak in extra reading fluency practice. Everybody in class is reading out loud every time there's any type of written instructions or directions. And it also helps with the fact that they're middle school students and they'll say, what are we supposed to do after you just read them? So reading them out loud together, great practice. So the next strategy, this is a during reading strategy, is called echo reading. And this gets us repeated readings, which also helps our comprehension, and we're practicing our prosody. So echo reading is so helpful because it helps reduce that cognitive load of students for decoding, and they can focus on the fluency. So echo reading looks like this. We are going to partner read. We're avoiding round robin reading. So we're going to partner read in a safe space. So the first partner A reads the first paragraph. Partner B is following along. When partner A is finished reading that one paragraph, now partner B echo reads it. That just means they're reading the same thing over again. So every paragraph is read twice, which of course will take twice as long. So we add that into account when we're planning. We don't have to have them echo read the entire text. Partner A is read, then partner B is read. What's helpful about that is if I'm a struggling reader, I'm going to be so focused, all my mental energy on decoding each word, that's where all my energy is going and I'm not paying attention to what the actual content says. If I'm an introvert, and even if I'm a good reader, I'm shy. And so I'm not really processing what I'm reading because I'm all up in my feelings. But I get to relax then when it's my partner's turn to read. And my partner reads, now I can listen and get the content. So the key findings around echo reading were measurable gains in fluency, in confidence, and in word accuracy. And it doesn't have to be overthought of creating these intentional partners. It could even just be lean over with your elbow partner or select a partner, decide who's going to be partner A and who's going to be partner B. Then another key ingredient to echo reading is after I've read and then my partner has echoed me, we're going to decide together or have a discussion about what the most important 2 to 3 words were in that paragraph, kind of like the main idea. What this helps is students really struggle with summarizing. Summarizing is a critical skill for reading comprehension, and even high schoolers still struggle with it. So by finding and selecting the 1 or 2 most important words in that paragraph, students are kind of scaffolding their way into finding the main idea. So that's difficult to model with just myself. So paragraph A, I read, then you read the same paragraph right after me. And then we talk together and decide what those 2 to 3 really important words were. I'm not going to write them down. I'm not going to do anything extra with them except just have that discussion. If I bring in writing, then that adds a whole other layer of complexity if I'm a struggling reader that I have to deal with. This should just be about me decoding and then getting a chance to listen and hear and comprehend. Also, if I'm teaching in class, how I would use this is I would start with choral reading. So I would introduce the text. I do the first 2 paragraphs together as a class where I'm previewing those, and then we read simultaneously. And then I might say, okay, lean over to your elbow partner and read the next 2 paragraphs chorally. And they do that. And I say, come back together. And now we're going to read the next 2 paragraphs with an echo read. And each partner, they can stay the same where the reader remains the reader and the echo remains the echo, or they can switch back and forth. But these become practiced. I wouldn't introduce these all at the same time. You introduce these once they get good at one, then you introduce the other. And then they're very proficient in both. So you can integrate them into the same reading and they can switch it up to kind of keep it moving and keep it engaging. And again, if you have those students who are sound sensitive and they're trying to read and they're surrounded by other readers, you might see kids doing this. So just being cognizant of that and creating a space for them, or what the school policy is, if they can step out to the hallway, or if there's a way to space students out. The third strategy I want to share with you is called read and review. And this is similar to echo reading. It's a during reading strategy. And the fact that it's a during reading strategy and it's a partner read, and it really focuses on metacognition. So helping them pay attention and thinking about what they're thinking and paying attention to what they're reading. So they're not wandering off. I've worked with different schools where they wanted just to try one thing. They didn't have a really excited staff. It was a very slow roll for their literacy initiatives. So they started with just this one strategy, just read and review, and asked all their teachers to do it once a week. As far as the return on their investment with this one strategy was huge. They saw their weekly quiz scores go up 30 to 60%. And my guess is it's just because the kids really started reading where they might have not been reading before. Here's a look at all of the research behind it, why this is an effective strategy. Here's what it looks like. So I'm partner A, you're partner B. I read the first paragraph. Once I'm done reading the first paragraph, I find a question about what I just read and ask you a question. And so what that does, I know I'm going to ask you a question. So as I'm reading, I'm now reading with a purpose, and I'm paying closer attention to what I'm reading because I'm trying to think of what I'm going to ask you when I'm done. You, my partner, are following along more attentively because you're anticipating what question I'm going to ask you and you want to be ready to answer it. So we're both reading more engaged and paying more attention. So I read, I might have to reskim to pull out a question, repeated reading. So that's going to help my comprehension. Then I ask you the question. You, my friend, might have to reskim the text to find the answer, repeated reading, and then you're going to answer the question. And then we switch. So paragraph 2, you now read and ask me a question about what you just read. I answer it, and we move back and forth through the text that way. Again, you can pair this with the other strategies. One text, we start with choral, we move to echo for a page, and then we end with read and review. Three during reading strategies, all with one text. Breaks it up and keeps their engagement. But again, after they've already been practiced and are proficient, the more that you do it, the better they will become. So I still have all of those benefits of I get to read, I get to be in a safe space, get a turn to read, think more deeply about what I'm reading. I get a lot of questions from teachers about the types of questions. What if they're only doing a DOK 1, like a depth of knowledge 1 level? So an easy question. It's fine. If they're doing an easy question, like what was the character's name? That's fine. The point is their mind, their brain is now paying attention to the text, maybe where it wasn't before. So it doesn't matter on the difficulty level of the question that they're asking. So that is a look at choral, echo, and read and review reading strategies, all during reading strategies. So if you take nothing else away today, make sure that you know every text Every class, every subject should have a before, a during, and an after reading strategy. And here's 3 that you can use as your during reading strategies. And as you have your classroom and you develop your own classroom kind of routines and procedures, you will be able to adapt these to whatever works best for your kids. Kids love reading when they can do it collaboratively because it's very social. And most adolescents love to be social. I wanted to mention a resource, and that is Saddleback Publishing, because these resources are very difficult to find. Decodable readers for teens. I mentioned at the beginning of the session about the difference between Lexiled leveled readers and decodable readers. So decodable being working on those skills that I can practice and sound out. Saddleback Publishing does a really nice job with creating these decodable readers for students who are in middle and high school. It does not look babyish or immature. It's nothing that they would be embarrassed to be caught reading or carrying. They even have the classics in graphic novels or in written all the way down to 2nd or 3rd grade text. They're also called high-low books, so high interest, low Lexile. So Lexile isn't a bad thing. It's just one piece of the puzzle and we can't rely on it too much. Remember, Charlotte's Web and 50 Shades of Grey are the same Lexile. Doesn't mean the same people should be reading it. So that's Saddleback Publishing. And right now these are about $12 a book. Sometimes some schools will give you classroom dollars for a library or for classroom supplies at the beginning of the year. So this might be something that you would want to spend some classroom funds on, because when you have time to do a drop everything and read, you want your students of all abilities to be able to grab something that they can read independently. And Saddleback Publishing is great for that. So you can just check out their website. So as we wrap up, what information is new for you? What is the most important information that you want to remember? And what is one action item that you have? This session marks the end of our time together, these 3 sessions. If you move on to high school methods courses, we will have a few sessions in that together that focus on the science of reading and what that looks like in the high school. I hope that you have found this time beneficial and that when you go into your classroom in the near future, that you'll be able to take some of these strategies and this understanding with you and apply it for your struggling readers. Thanks and best of luck.